Hello students, welcome back to our series Unlocking the Government Budget. In our previous video, that was our video 1, we covered the basic meaning and introduction of government budget. With that, we also understood what are the different objectives of the government budget. Now in this video, we are going to start with our next very important topic, that is components of budget. So let us begin with our video 2 with the new topic, components of budget. This topic is going to be very important. From here we are going to get lots of questions. So let us understand what are the different components of budget. So first of all, you should know that there are basically two components of budget. So if I tell you in brief, it is nothing but revenue budget and capital budget. So basically the two major components of budget is revenue budget and capital budget. Again, revenue budget is of two types, that is revenue receipts and revenue expenditure. Same way, capital budget is of two types, that is capital receipts and capital expenditure. So now in yesterday's lecture, in our last video, we have already studied that government budget is nothing but the expenses and incomes of the government, that how the government is going to plan its finances. So same way, the components also talks about something like that. Components can be a revenue budget, it can be a capital budget. Revenue budget is again of two types, that is revenue receipts, which is nothing but the income of the government, and revenue expenditure, which is nothing but the expenses of the government. Same way, under capital budget, we have two types. Capital receipts is nothing but the income of the government, and capital expenditure is nothing but the type of an expense for the government. So please make sure that you remember this particular flow chart. Now one by one, we are going to see both of them individually. Components of budget refers to the structure of the budget, the same budget which we saw in the last slide. So the two main components of budget are, first, it is revenue budget. It deals with revenue aspect of the government budget. With the name itself, you should know revenue. What is revenue? Revenue is nothing but the income aspect for the government. And it explains how revenue is generated or collected by the government and how it is going to be allocated through various expenditure heads. So whatever revenue is collected by the government, how we are going to allocate it for different expenses. So revenue budget can be of two types, revenue receipts RR, revenue expenditure RE. Second component of budget is capital budget. So this is going to deal with capital aspect of the government. It again has two types, capital receipts CR and capital expenditure CE. Now we are going to talk about the components budget which can also be categorized. So basically we are going to discuss the components of budget which can also be categorized through two means, that is through receipts and through expenditure. If we talk about through receipts and expenditure, we have these components of two types, budget receipts and budget expenditure. Under budget receipts, we will have revenue receipt and capital receipt. Under budget expenditure, we have two types, that is revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. Okay, so you can divide the components of budget in this way as well. In both the ways, it is going to be correct. First of all, what is budget receipts? So budget receipts, very important, refers to the estimated money receipts of the government from all the sources during a given fiscal year. Budget receipts can be classified as again two types. In a very simple language, budget receipts is nothing but the total money receipts or the total money income which the government is going to receive from the various sources. Now, what are the sources of revenue for the government? We will be seeing in the upcoming slides. But as of for now, you understand that budget receipts is nothing but the income or the money generated by the government through various sources. During a one fiscal year is nothing but your financial year which starts from 1st April to 31st March. Now again it has two components, revenue receipts and capital receipts. So you can look at this chart wherein very clearly it has been specified budget receipt is of two types, revenue receipt and capital receipt. The different things which come under revenue receipt is the tax revenue and non-tax revenue. The different components of capital receipt is borrowings, recovery of loan and some other deposits. We are going to see each one of them very specifically. First of all, what is revenue receipt? So, revenue receipt refers to those receipts which neither create any liability nor causes any reduction in the asset for the government. Very important. What is revenue receipt? Revenue receipt is the receipt or it's the income of the government which will not create any liability. So, not create any liability, neither it will cause any reduction in the assets. So, it will not create any liability for the government as well as it will not create any, or it will not reduce any asset of the government. So, these kind of expenses are regular and recurring in nature. Government is going to receive it in the normal course of activities. So, regular and recurring means these are the receipts for the government which are going to be regular in nature, very frequent. A receipt is a revenue receipt if it satisfies the two following essential conditions. Now, to call a receipt as a revenue receipt, there are two basic conditions which it needs to be followed or which it needs to be satisfied. First condition is the same what we studied under the meaning of it, that is the receipt must not create any liability for the government. So, first condition for a receipt to be called as a revenue receipt is it should not create any liability for the government. Example, taxes levied by the government are revenue receipt as they do not create any liability. We all pay taxes? Yes, definitely we pay taxes. To whom do you pay taxes? So, you pay taxes to the government. So, the government, when you pay taxes to the government is not liable for anything to do the repay to you all, right? To do any kind of repayment to you all. It is not the liability of the government. So, it is not creating any liability. So, taxes levied can be the example of revenue receipts. Any amount borrowed by the government is not a revenue receipt as it causes increase in the liability in terms of repayment of borrowing. So, just imagine if government has done some borrowings or has taken loan. So, these borrowings we already know borrowings and loans are nothing but your liability. This we are studying from the beginning. Any borrowings made or any loans taken from any institution, any financial institution or from be in any place, it creates liability on a person. So, same way when government borrows loan, it will create a liability and hence borrowings cannot be said to be a revenue receipt. So, that is one thing. Second condition is the receipt does not cause any decrease in the asset. The receipt should not cause any reduction in asset, any decrease in asset. Then only that receipt will be called as a revenue receipt. Example, receipt from sale of share of public enterprise is not a revenue receipt as it leads to reduction in the asset of the government. Say suppose there is one share which belongs to government. Now, this share is sold by the government. Government sells its shares. So, this shares were the kind of asset for the government. When government sells these shares, the asset is reducing. So, that is why any time when government sells its shares, it will not be considered as revenue receipts because it is reducing the asset of the government. And we have said that revenue receipt will not reduce or decrease the assets of the government. So that is one case. Now, very important, two different sources of revenue receipt. What are the two different sources for revenue receipts which the government is going to get? So, it is from tax revenue and it non-tax revenue. So, tax revenue is called as the main source of revenue for the government. The major, most important source of revenue from the government is the tax revenue. Apart from tax, there is also some sources through which the government raises its income, but that will be called as non-tax revenue. So, first of all, let us discuss about tax revenue. Tax revenue refers to sum of receipts from taxes and other duties imposed by the government. Tax is something which is going to be imposed by the government, and that is the major source of income for the government. So, tax is something which is a compulsory payment. Everybody has to pay it, be it be an individual people, be it be a companies, be it be the producer. It is going to be paid by everyone. And when you pay taxes, government is not going to do any returns to you personally. For example, if I am paying taxes to the government, then government will not say that, okay, specifically for you, I am going to construct a bridge. Only you can use it, or only you can take benefit of a public park. No, government does not returns or does anything for one specific individual or for one specific organization or unit for that matter. Whatever government does, it is going to be for the beneficial of the entire country. So that is why this is a compulsory payment and government will not give the returns to any specific individual. So two aspects of taxes again we have, very important aspects. First, tax is a compulsory payment, that is no one can refuse to pay it. Tax is something which is compulsory. Nobody can say that I will not pay tax. Okay, I cannot come up and say that I will not pay tax. It's a compulsory thing. And second, tax receipts are spent by government for common benefit of people in the country. A taxpayer cannot expect that tax amount will be used for his direct benefit. As I said, if I am paying tax to the government will not give me benefits directly. It will indirectly give me the benefits, of course, by constructing a bridge, electricity, water supply, sanitation through different modes. But specifically, it will not focus on one person that, okay, A has paid me tax, so I will give him the returns. No, that is not possible. So, very important two aspects of tax. Tax revenue is the main source of regular receipt of the government. I already said tax is called as a major source for the government, major source of income for the government. So, government will collect various kind of taxes from public to meet its day-to-day expenditure, and there is a strict action against anyone who fails to pay the taxes. So, see, government, how are we expecting government to do welfare for the country? Government is also not going to take out money from their pockets, of course. So, government will charge taxes from each and every individual residing in the country, and from their tax money, government is going to do welfare for the country. Okay, so that is the one thing. Now, tax revenue can again be classified into two different forms, that is direct tax and indirect tax. This thing you all should know. What is direct tax and what is indirect tax? Indirect tax is nowadays called as GST, that is goods and services tax. First of all, what is direct tax? So, basically direct tax, keep this in mind, direct tax is something which is usually paid by people or a firm or an organization. Okay, this is nothing but your direct tax. Direct tax refers to taxes that are imposed on property and income of individuals and companies. Their burden cannot be shifted to other person or entity. Direct tax is usually imposed on people and companies for their property or on their income. So, as an individual, if I am working in an organization, I receive salary. Yes, now that I will have to pay taxes from that salary amount. Now, when I pay taxes, it is my duty that I have to pay the taxes. I cannot shift the burden of paying the tax to my friends, my relatives, or my parents, or anyone else. Since I am earning, I am obliged to pay the tax. Nobody else will pay the taxes on my behalf. Okay, so that is why we say direct tax is something which cannot be shifted. So they are imposed on individuals and companies. Their monetary burden is borne by those on whom they are levied. So direct tax is going to be levied on me and I am going to be liable to pay this tax. Okay, I cannot shift this burden to anybody else. Liability to pay the tax is nothing but called as impact. Two very important terms, impact, incidence. Impact means the person who is liable to pay the tax, and incidence means the person who is actually paying the tax. Okay. So, when it comes to direct tax, the liable and incident is the same person. As I said, I am earning, so I am responsible or I am liable to pay the taxes. So, the impact is on me. Okay, so the impact is on me. And actually, when it comes to paying the taxes, I am only going to pay it. I cannot shift my burden of paying tax on anybody else. So, again, the incident is also on me, right? So, the liability to pay tax is the impact. Actual burden of the tax is called as incidence, which lie on the same person. That is, burden cannot be shifted on others. Example, in the case of income tax, the liability to pay tax, that is impact, and the actual burden is on the same person on whom it is levied. So, as I said, the impact and incident is both the thing is on me. Since I am paying direct tax, income of the consumer or income of the person. So, I am going to pay direct tax from the income which I am receiving. They will directly affect the level of income and purchasing power of people and help to change the level of aggregate demand in the economy. We have already understood that what happens when the direct tax increases or decreases, because direct tax is directly related with your disposable income. Okay. Example, income tax, corporate tax, interest tax, wealth tax, death duty, capital gain tax, etc. All of these are the examples of direct tax. And direct tax can be progressive in nature, regressive in nature, or proportional in nature. Very important, you should know direct tax can be of these three categories. Next is indirect taxes. Indirect taxes are also called as GST, and these are those taxes which can be shifted on another person. Okay, so usually indirect taxes are charged on the producers for production of goods and services. So, but their monetary burden can be transferred to some other person or by the final users of goods and services rather than the person on whom the tax is being levied. So, they are imposed on goods and services. GST or indirect taxes are always imposed on goods and services. Here, the liability to pay the tax, that is impact, and the actual burden, that is incidence, is going to be on the different person. So, liability, it can be shifted, the burden can be shifted. Impact or the liable to pay the tax is the seller, but incident is on the consumer, because consumer is going to pay the taxes. So, in case of GST, the liability to pay the tax to the government is on the seller. So, impact is the seller, but the actual burden is borne by the consumers, because sellers collect GST from them. Best example, when we order food from Zomato or Swiggy, when you place an order, you will see the price is for, say, suppose 200. When you add it to your card and go for a final payment, you can see that this amount has become 250. Now, what is this extra 50 rupees for? So, this extra 50 rupees is nothing but your GST. So, whenever you go for movies, whenever you eat food in restaurants or anything, you have to pay this. Whenever you purchase a laptop, washing machine, television, or all of these things, you are going to pay the GST. The buyer is going to pay the GST. If you haven't noticed till now, then please go and check the invoice if you have done any shopping, if your parents have done any shopping, or if you have gone out for your dinner or lunches. So you can notice that you have to pay GST over there. So, burden of indirect tax can be very easily shifted. The best example of indirect tax, that is IT, is GST, goods and services tax. Now, very important thing and very interesting thing, indirect taxes are something which are not compulsory. Yes, anybody can escape from paying the indirect taxes. They can be avoided by not entering into the transaction which call for such taxes. Don't order food from Zomato. Don't go for watching movies in the theater. Don't go for dinners in a restaurant. You can avoid that. You will be able to avoid the paying of GST very easily. Don't buy laptop. So that is how you can avoid paying GST. You will by not entering into such kind of transactions. Whereas if I talk about direct tax, it was something which was compulsory, which you cannot avoid, which you will never be able to avoid. It is a compulsory payment. Whereas indirect taxes are not the compulsory payment. You can avoid avoid paying GST by not entering into such transaction. Example, consumer may have taxes by purchasing Khadi Gram Udyog items as there is no indirect tax on Khadi items. Now, you go and buy Khadi items, don't go and in a shopping mall and buy branded clothes, rather go and buy Khadi products. So, on Khadi products, you don't have to pay GST. Very simple. Now, how to classify a tax as a direct tax or an indirect tax? So, a tax will be called as a direct tax if its burden cannot be shifted. Example, income tax is a direct tax since its impact and incident is on the same person. So, any tax wherein the impact and incidence is on the same person will be called as a direct tax, whose burden cannot be shifted from one person to another. Whereas indirect tax, burden of indirect tax can be very easily shifted from one person to another. So, GST is an indirect tax as its impact and incident lie on the different person. Liable is the seller, but incidence is on the consumer. Now, few items how you can categorize as direct tax, indirect tax. First is corporation tax. Corporation tax is the tax which needs to be paid by the business. Okay, so we know any tax which is paid by business on property or on income is nothing but your direct tax. So, direct tax, it is a form of or a direct tax. Its impact and incidence lie on the same person. It is a direct tax as its liability to pay the tax, that is impact, and actual burden of the tax, that is incident, lie on the same person. Okay, same firm has to pay it. And for that matter, what about GST? We know goods and services, directly it is nothing but an indirect tax. So, GST is an indirect tax wherein the impact and incidence lie on the different persons, on two different persons, and the burden of GST can be shifted from one person to another. Now, that was related to tax revenue. Next comes is non-tax revenue. So, non-tax revenue refers to receipts of the government from all the sources other than those of tax receipts. So, we know that the revenue of a government can be generated from tax. Apart from that, there is also something called as non-tax revenue from where the government can generate its more income. So, let us see what are those sources. First is government. If at all government has given loan to somebody, government has given loan to some state government or some union territories or to any foreign country or to private enterprises, then in return of that loan, government is going to receive an interest. This interest is nothing but the income for the government. So apart from tax, this is also one of the form of income which the government is going to generate. So yes, first one is interest. Read it quickly. Government receives interest on loans given by it to the state government, union territories, private enterprise, general public. Interest received from these loans is an important source of non-tax revenue. Next is profits and dividend. So if at all government has invested in any of the public sector undertakings, or if invested in some other things like in Indian Railways, LIC, BHAL, so all of these are the public enterprises. So if government has invested over there, so government will also receive the profit and the dividends from those companies, right? So government earns profit through public sector undertaking like Indian Railways, LIC, BHAL, etc. It will earn profit from the sale proceed of the product of such public enterprises. Government also gets dividend from its investment in other companies. So government will receive profit as well as dividend. Again, a very important source of income. Next is fees. So by now, I don't think so you all have gone through that process or not. But usually when you appear for different government exams, now what do you think? People cannot get entry into the government jobs or government sector very easily. They have to appear for different exams. Now, for appearing for those exams, you have to pay a certain amount of fees. So that is also the part of a income generation by the government. So fees refers to charges imposed by the government to cover the cost of recurring services provided by it. Government is providing so many things to us, right? So in some or the other way, government will take some or the other kind of money from us as well. So this is nothing but fees. Such services are generally in public interest and fees is paid by those who receive such services. It is also a compulsory contribution like tax. Court fees, registration fees, import fees are some of the few examples of fees through which the government is going to generate its income. Next comes license fees. So we all know that till now, till present, there are certain things for which we require license from the government. Best example, if you want to keep a gun at your house, at your home, you need a proper license from the government. If you want to start your business in liquor, you want to open a liquor shop, for that also you will need a license for the government. And when you go and apply for this license, you have to pay certain amount of money to the government, and that is called as license fee. So it is a payment charged by government to grant permission for something. License fee paid for permission for keeping a gun or to obtain national permit for commercial vehicles. So there are certain things on which we need license from the government. To keep or to possess those things, we need a proper license from the government, and that for buying that license, you will have to pay some amount of fees to the government. Then comes fines and penalties. So if you are violating any rules and regulations given by government, you will have to pay fines and penalties to them. Again, it's a source of income for the government. So those payments which are imposed on lawbreakers, anyone who is violating or breaking the laws or the rules and regulations made by the government. Fine for jumping red light or penalty for non-payment of tax. Anytime if you fail to pay tax, you have to pay a penalty on it. So that is also going to go in the pockets of government. Jumping red light on traffic signal, if you are breaking any traffic laws, traffic rules and regulation, again you have to pay a fine for it. So fines are different from taxes, as the former is levied to maintain law and order, whereas the latter is imposed to generate revenue. Fines and taxes are two different things. Fine is something which you are going to get because of breaking or violating of laws, whereas taxes is something which you have to pay in order to generate the revenue for government, right? Then comes escheats. It refers to claim of the government on property of a person who dies without leaving behind any legal heir or a will. See, there is a possibility that a person who possesses too much of properties or too much of money, and there is nobody to take over his properties or his money once he is passed, he is no more. So in that case, everything goes in the hands of the government. So again, it's a source of income. Gifts and grants. So gifts and grants which government will receive from state government, union territories, foreign countries, so on. So government receive gifts and grants from foreign government and international organization. Sometimes individuals and companies also voluntarily gift money to the government. So sometimes these individuals or companies also give some kind of gift to the government. And such gifts are not fixed source of revenue and are generally received during the national crisis such as war and flood. So, all of these things are not fixed. These are not the fixed source of revenue. These are all the variable source of revenue, because these gifts and grants will be received by the government whenever there is urgency or any national crisis happened in the country. For example, earthquake, flood, war, etc. Then comes forfeitures. So, these are in the form of penalties which are imposed by courts for non-compliance of orders or non-fulfillment of contract, etc. If anybody is again failing to do the compliance, follow the compliances or fulfillment of contracts, if there is any breakage of contract, then again the person will have to pay some kind of penalties which is called as forfeitures to the government. Special assessment, it is the payment made by owners of those properties whose value has appreciated due to developmental activities of the government. If your house is near a metro station or near a shopping mall, the price of your house, the value of your house increases, and when that happens, you have to pay certain amount of that beneficial money to the government. So, example, if value of a property near a metro station has increased, then a part of developmental expenditure is recovered from the owners of such property in the form of special assessment. So, if your house is near a metro station is a very good station. You can travel from one place to another very comfortably, nicely with full air conditioning. So, if your house is near this station, the value of your house, the money value of your house, okay, money value of your house increases, and in this case, the owner of that house has to pay or give something to the government, and that is called as special assessment. Now first we will discuss capital receipt, what it is. So in a very simple language, capital receipts are nothing but those kind of receipt which will either create a liability or it will cause a reduction in the asset of the government. So capital receipts are basically those kind of receipts which will create liability for the government, or it will cause reduction in any of the asset of the government. These kind of receipts are basically called as capital receipts. These are the receipts which are non-recurring in nature, which are non-routine in nature. That means capital receipts are those receipts which will not take place very frequently. These are non-recurring in nature. Whereas when we studied revenue receipts, we had seen that those receipts were in recurring nature. So basic difference between revenue receipt and capital receipts. All the capital receipts are non-recurring or non-routine in nature. So a receipt is a capital receipt if it satisfies any one of the two conditions. Again, to call a receipt as a capital receipt, we have two major conditions. If they satisfy the condition, then only the particular receipt will be called as a capital receipt. First condition says the receipt must create a liability for the government. So, to call any receipt as a capital receipt, it should create a liability for the government. Only then that receipt will be called as a capital receipt. For example, borrowings. Borrowings are the best example of capital receipt. So, borrowings are capital receipt as they lead to an increase in the liability of the government. It's but obvious, right? If government is borrowing money from any other financial institution, from any union territory or from any other foreign country, then it will create a liability on the government, right? We know that borrowings or taking loan will always create a liability on a particular unit. So here we are talking about government, so it will create a liability for the government. So borrowings or taking loan will be the part of a capital receipt, or it can be called as a capital receipt. However, tax received is not a capital receipt as it does not result in any creation of any liability. We have already studied about tax revenue. What are taxes? Direct taxes, indirect taxes. There also we studied. In tax, what is happening? Basically, citizens of the country are going to pay some kind of money to the government, but that money will not create any liability on the government because that is one of the source of income for the government. Government is not liable to do anything for any one particular citizen. So that is why taxes will not be considered as a capital receipts. They will always be considered as revenue receipts for the government. Whereas if we talk about borrowings or taking loan, that will be always a capital receipt since it is creating liability on the government. So simple thing. Second condition is the receipts must cause decrease in the asset. Any receipt to be called as a capital receipt should decrease the asset of the government. First condition, it should increase or it should create liability on the government. Second is, it should decrease the asset of the government. So example over here is, receipt from sale of shares of public enterprise is a capital receipt as it leads to reduction in the asset of the government. For example, there are shares which belongs to government. Okay, there are shares which belongs to the government. And we know that shares are nothing but the form of asset for the government. But what if in future government is going to sell this shares? Government is selling away these shares. Now when government is selling away these shares, the reduction of asset is happening. That means now these shares will no longer be the part of government. So this asset has been reduced of the government. So that is why sale of shares which belongs to the government, which belongs to any public enterprise, when it gets sold out or when it gets sold out, basically there will be a reduction in the asset of the government. And again, that kind of reduction in the asset will be called as a capital receipt. Now, there are different sources of capital receipts, like how we studied about the sources of revenue receipts. Again, there are different sources for capital receipts, which we can broadly classify into three different groups. Let us see what are those three things. First of all is borrowings. As I said, if at all government is borrowing some money from any financial institution, from any union territories or from any other foreign country, in that case, government will be liable to repay them, right? For example, this is India and this is USA. Say suppose India is borrowing money from USA. Now again, India will have to repay it. But obvious, India will have to repay this. Since we want to repay the money, since we are going to repay it, it becomes a liability on the government. It is a liability, okay? Now, Indian government is liable to repay the money which they have borrowed from the foreign country, that is USA. So, borrowing is one of the major source of capital receipt. Borrowings are the funds raised by government to meet excess expenditure. But obvious, when will the government do borrowing? Government will do the borrowing when its receipts are less and expenses are more. Basically, when the income of government is less and the expenses of the government is more. In that situation, government will prefer to borrow money from the other countries or from the foreign countries. So, this is what happens. So, government can borrow funds from open market, OMO, open market operations. Either it can borrow money from RBI, that is Reserve Bank of India. RBI is our central bank. Okay, this we have studied in our chapter Money and Banking. Next is foreign governments. So, Indian government can borrow loans or borrow money from USA, England, Russia, Japan or from any other foreign country. So, foreign government loan taking from foreign governments is also one of the major source of capital receipt. Next is international institutions. Government can either borrow loan from several other international associations or institutions like World Bank, IMF, that is International Monetary Funds. Borrowings are capital receipts as they create liability for the government. There are various sources through which government can borrow money. What are the sources? We already saw, and ultimately we see that any borrowings or any of these things for that matter will create a liability for the government. Anything which creates a liability, any receipt which create a liability for the government will be considered as a capital receipt. Next source is recovery of loans. Say suppose Indian government has given loan to USA. Now USA has completely repaid the loan to the Indian government. So now what is happening? There will be reduction in asset. How? Let us see. Say suppose this is India, this is USA. India has given loan to USA. And in that loan or in that borrowing, USA might be paying interest to India. Of course, since USA has borrowed loan from India, USA will have to repay the entire amount, that is the principal amount, with interest. So now with that interest, India is receiving interest, and this interest is nothing but an asset for our country, because every month we are receiving certain amount of money. It's an income for us. It's an asset for us. So that is why here what will happen? It is a type of capital receipt, because this is going to get reduced. The asset of Indian government is getting reduced because now USA is going to completely do the repayment of their loan or of their borrowings. Fine. So government grant various loans to state government or union territories. Now, I have taken an international example. Government also gives loan to certain other state governments, financial institutions, or even for that matter to union territories. So, recovery of such loan is a capital receipt, as it is going to reduce the asset of the government. Recovery of this loan means what? When this particular person or when this particular entity repays the entire loan to the Indian government with the principal and the interest amount, there will be reduction in asset, because now no longer Indian government will be receiving interest. So again, this is recovery of loan is nothing but the source of capital receipt. Then comes other receipts. Under other receipts, we have several other things, like first is disinvestment. So disinvestment refers to the act of selling a part of whole share or selected public sector undertakings held by the government. Disinvestment means when any enterprise which belongs to the government is getting sold out to any private sector, that particular activity is called as disinvestment. Again, here what is happening? There will be reduction in the asset of the government. So again, disinvestment is nothing but the capital receipt. Say suppose there is one organization called as ABC organization and it belongs to the government. Okay, it is a public sector. Now they are going to disinvest it and going to make it as a private sector. They are selling off this organization and making it a private sector. So what will happen? Basically, here there is a conversion of government sector company to a public sector. Okay, so basically now this ABC organization becomes a private sector company. So here what we have done, government has done the disinvestment. Their enterprise, which used to belong to government, now it belongs to some other private person. So this is nothing but disinvestment. Again, it is reducing the asset of the government, because government is selling off its own company, its own enterprise. So again, disinvestment is the part of a capital receipt. They are termed as a capital receipt as they reduce the asset of the government. Very important. Disinvestment is also the part of capital receipt, because again there is going to be a reduction in the government asset, since the entire organization or the entire company is getting sold off, right, to a private person or to any other XYZ person. So government holds ownership in various PSUs, that is public sector enterprises, in the form of equity shares. Again, there is a possibility that government might have some equity shares of other companies. So when government sells a part of whole of its shares, it leads to transfer of ownership of PSU to the private enterprise. This is what I said. When government decides to sell off the part of its share to private people, now there will be a conversion of government company to a private company. So that means again it's a reduction in the asset of the government, and reduction in the asset of the government is one of the very important condition of capital receipt. Then comes small savings. Small savings refers to fund raised from public in the form of post office deposits, national savings certificates, NSC, Kisan Vikas Patras, etc. They are treated as capital receipt as they lead to increase in liability. Now there is some kind of small savings which the government do from various other sources which will raise money from. Again, since they are raising money from those sources, they will be liable to repay it. So again, it is creating a liability for the government. It is creating a liability for the government, and creation of liability means nothing but capital receipt. Now, how do you classify a receipt as a revenue receipt or a capital receipt? So by now, I hope you all have understood very clearly that what is the difference between revenue receipt and capital receipt. Basic difference, if you know, that is enough. You can very easily classify if you know the basic difference between capital receipt and revenue receipt. First, a receipt is a capital receipt if it creates a liability or reduces an asset. Recently, we studied that. When we talk about receipt, it can be of two types, revenue receipt and capital receipt. How are you going to identify that which receipt will be called as a revenue receipt and which receipt will be called as a capital receipt? So, any receipt will be called as a capital receipt if it either creates liability or if it reduces an asset. And a receipt is a revenue receipt if it neither creates liability nor reduces any asset. So just opposite of capital receipt is your revenue receipt, or just opposite of your revenue receipt is your capital receipt. So revenue receipt is the receipt which will not create any liability on the government, as well as it will not reduce any asset of the government. So few examples we can take. First is loan from the World Bank. If at all Indian government has taken loan or has done borrowings from World Bank, which kind of receipt is this? Will it be a revenue receipt or will it be a capital receipt? Very simple, it is going to be a capital receipt, because loan taken from the World Bank will basically create liability for the government. As we know, whenever government does borrowings or take loan from any other financial institution, union territories or foreign countries, it is going to create liability on the government. So this example, loan from the World Bank, is clearly the example of a capital receipt, since this transaction or this receipt is going to create liability on the government. So it is a capital receipt as it creates liability for the government. Very simple. One more we will see, income tax received by the government. Tax received by the government is what? Of course, it is going to be a revenue receipt, because it is not creating any liability as well as it is not reducing any asset of the government. So when any receipt does not create any liability on the government or does not reduces the asset of the government, those kind of receipts are called as revenue receipts. And taxes are something which will not create any liability on the government, which will not reduce any asset of the government. So indirect tax or income tax or direct tax are going to be the type of revenue receipts. So it is a revenue receipt, see, as it creates neither any liability nor it reduces any asset of the government. So here we understand that how are you going to identify the difference between capital receipt and revenue receipt. If you know the basic things, meaning of revenue receipt and capital receipt, you can easily crack that which kind of receipt the following example talks about.
Thank you for watching our video. For more updates, reach us on www.tgcampus.com or 1800-267-2677 or connect@tgcampus.com. Like and subscribe to our YouTube channel TG Campus In. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook and WhatsApp. Join our official Telegram channel TG Campus In. Chat with us on 8655682401.